fashioned against us will stand. The battle belongs to the Lord, and we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. When the power of darkness comes in like a flood, the battle belongs to the Lord. He's raised up a standard, the power of his blood. The battle belongs to the Lord, and we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. When your enemy presses in hard, do not fear. The battle belongs to the Lord. Take courage, my friend, your redemption is near. The battle belongs to the Lord, and we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord.
Landon for the evening. I assume he is gone and he's not going to sneak in here. I came in and I was all ready and then I was like, wait a second, is this my night? All right, so I have been tasked, you can turn my volume down because I'm going to start yelling now. I have been tasked to discuss the temple, things associated with the temple, and really just kind of stay there. And that's hard. I just want to acknowledge that here at the beginning. Because when I sat down and I started looking at it, there is a massive amount of material that I want to cover tonight. And so if you would like to, write these passages down. And they're in chapters, except for the Luke one. Because that's what I'm going to try to do tonight. We're going to find out how far I get. We're going to take a look at the tabernacle. We're going to take a look at the temple. We're going to look at how it's structured, how it functioned. And then we're going to kind of take a look at how the priesthood changes when the temple comes in. And so that's that 1 Chronicles 24, Luke chapter 1. If this takes a long time, read it yourself. If it doesn't take a long time, I'm going to go back and do something I wanted to do at the end of my last class. So you'll get that. We're going to start with Exodus 35. I want to start with the tabernacle because the tabernacle is the original and the temple is the updated. Arguably, we could even go further back than that, and you can say Garden of Eden is original, tabernacle is updated off of that, and temple is updated off of that, and then Revelation talks about the church, and it's kind of an updated even off of the temple. But we're not going to get too far, because if I get too far, we'll never get anywhere. But I want to start here in chapter 35 and 36 and discuss the tabernacle. I have some images. They're all artists' representations, but I want you to kind of get in your mind what the tabernacle was. The tabernacle is very different than the temple. In chapter 35 of Exodus, in 36 really is where it's being done. You can also take a look at that one back in chapter 26, and it talks a lot about the details. The tabernacle is a variety of fabrics layered over each other. It is inside of a fabric courtyard fencing area. It is wooden paneled on the inside. It is well designed, and it evokes an image of otherworldliness. When you enter in, the lighting is low. It's full of incense smells. What you can see are colors that you're not always going to see together. The purple and the blue and the scarlet that are there. The common people are probably not wearing these. These are very expensive colors. So it evokes that wealth, that otherworldliness when you're inside of the tabernacle. You can see the curtain that is in front of you with images on it. All around you are images of the cherubim and palm trees and flowers that are fully in bloom and pomegranates. If you remember nothing else from this night, the temple and the tabernacle are covered in pomegranates. I don't know why that's the one. I'm sure somebody can tell me. But they are covered in pomegranates. Evidently, that is like the pinnacle of luxury and wealth and blooming. Yes, pomegranates are everywhere. Anybody want to comment on that? I see Clay is gesturing with his pencil. Fertility. I'll go with it. I'll go with it. So that's what we've got here. Look also, I liked this image because it reminds us that during the 40 years of wandering, it's not just a building there. God dwelt over this thing. His pillar of fire every night, his pillar of cloud during the day, never wavered from there, but was always visible. And so anywhere in the camp, anywhere for miles around, you can look and you could literally see God. Even if you weren't a Levite or of the sons of Aaron, and you weren't actually allowed further than the doorway of the courtyard. And you never really got to go inside except for the brief times when they would tear it down and you could see bits of it at a distance because you don't touch it because you're of Asher. Hey, I'll talk about it. You're not of Levi. So that's what we're looking at here is this tabernacle. It's put together. There's a few things about the tabernacle I really want to emphasize. Not so much of the structure, but how it is put together or how it's funded. In chapter 35, starting off in verse 4, Moses gives commands to the congregation of the people, and he says, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Whoever take from among you a contribution to the Lord, whoever is of a generous heart, let him bring the Lord's contribution, gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarns, fine twined linen, goat hair, tanned ram skins, goat skins, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and the fragrant incense, the onyx stones, the stones for the setting, for the ephod, and for the breastplate. Let every skilled craftsman among you come forward and make these things." Verse 10 down through verse 19. And then in verse 20, they did this. All of the congregation of the people of Israel departed from the presence of Moses. They came, everyone whose heart stirred him, everyone whose spirit moved him, and brought the Lord's contribution to be used for the tent of meeting, for all of its service and its holy garments. And they came, both men and women, all who had a willing heart, brooches and earrings and signet rings and armlets. All sorts of gold objects are being dedicated there. All of the things that they can make, that they can spin, that they can tan, are all being dedicated and given to God. And in verse 29, all of the men and the women, the people of Israel whose heart moved them to bring anything for the work that the Lord had commanded by Moses to be done, brought it as a freewill offering to the Lord. I have some questions for you. Where did they get their wealth? Egypt. Who, by extension then, is really funding the building of the tabernacle? You could say God. That's not the direction I want to go. Pharaoh. Egypt is. Because we're going to make a connection here when we get over to the temple. Egypt is funding it. It comes out of their coffers, and it was taken and then given by the people. Then they are going to be the ones doing the work. In verse 30 down through the beginning of chapter 36, we're introduced to a couple of individuals. We're told that one of them is a man named Bezalel. He is of the tribe of Judah. He's been filled with the Spirit of God, with skill, with intelligence, with knowledge, with all craftsmanship. And he has a compatriot whose name down in verse 34 is Oholiab. I should have practiced that one. Son of Ahimash of the tribe of Dan. These two individuals are craftsmen. They are kind of over everything. And they are the ones who organize all of the other craftsmen in order to make everything that's going to be utilized for the tabernacle. And that's the rest of chapter 36 there. So this is your reminder. This is our tabernacle here. This is your closer look. Note the structure of the tabernacle, that you have this three length where one of them is most holies and two of them are holies. So you've got this structure. You walk in, you're in the holy place, you have the candelabra there, you have the table for showbread. Note how many of them there are. There's one candelabra, one table for showbread, one table for incense. Pay attention to that. We're going to talk about it later. There's this curtain that goes between that you can see there. So the curtain on the one side blocking people from looking in, the curtain on the inside blocking people from seeing God between the cherubim that are on the ark of God. And it is in the Holy of Holies. The most holy place only entered on what day? Day of Atonement. Some of you newfangled people might say Yom Kippur. I don't, but somebody might. Okay, does anybody have any questions or any comments on the tabernacle? It's not what we're here to talk about, but it took 10 minutes because it is the beginning of what the temple is going to be. Yes?
I had forgotten, kind of got caught in context and email, that there's only one menorah in the tabernacle, but 10 in the temple.
Yes.
Do you have any idea why that would be?
Solomon had a whole lot more gold. I think a lot of our answers are going to be Solomon had a whole lot more. One, you don't really need nearly as much room. The tabernacle itself is not as large. I think it's half the size of what the temple is going to be. So it's much more cramped. You put a candelabra in there, and it's going to be able to handle it. But when we get to Solomon's, I do think there's a slight answer to yours, and I'm going to talk about it when we get there. But you're on the right track. Okay, let's talk about temple. Go with me to 1 Chronicles 22. I think we'll start there. 1 Chronicles 22. Let's make some connections now. We've talked about how the tabernacle is funded, how the tabernacle was structured, how the tabernacle was built, who is the ones who do the building. And so here we are in 1 Chronicles 22, and we are starting with David. David is the originator of the temple. He's the one who wanted to build it. God is the one who told him no. David then says, fine, I'm going to get everything else. And so he starts working on it. In verse 2 of 1 Chronicles in chapter 22, David starts to gather things together. He commands all of the resident aliens who are in the land of Israel, and he sets stone cutters to prepare dressed stones for the building of the house of God. David provides great quantity of iron for nails and bronze in quantities beyond weighing, and cedar timbers without number for the Sidonians and the Tyrians. Brought the great quantities of cedar down to David. And David says, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all the lands. I will therefore make preparation for it. So David provided materials in great quantity before his death. Probably the last 7 or so years. Absalom's thing ends, and then we get these stories about him preparing for the building of the temple. Maybe longer than that, but at the very minimum, about those last 5 to 7 years of his reign. He gives orders to Solomon, verse 6 down through the end of the chapter. Solomon, you are to do this. This is what I have prepared for you. Down in verse 14, with great pains I have provided for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, bronze and iron beyond weighing, for there is much, so much of it. Timber and stone, too, I have provided. To these you must add. Hold on a second. We have so much he can't count it. And David says, this is not enough. I didn't get enough. You have to add to this. You have an abundance of workmen. Verse 15. Stonecutters, masons, carpenters, craftsmen, without number, skilled in working gold and silver, bronze and iron. Arise and work, the Lord be with you. And he commands all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon in the endeavor that they are to be doing. Now, we're going to skip over a little bit and go to chapter 29. In chapter 29, we get the real pairing between tabernacle and temple preparations. David does a lot, and he kind of skews our results a little bit. So we're going to ignore him, which is hard to do because he's David. But in 1 Chronicles 29, we look on the outside now, and people begin to offer things. David says, this is all of the things that I have brought. And he begins listing them again. He says, I'm opening up my treasures. But in verse 6 of chapter 29 of 1 Chronicles, then the leaders of fathers' houses made their free will offerings, as did all the leaders of the tribes, the commanders of thousands and hundreds, and officers over the king's work. They gave for the service of the house of God 5,000 talents and 10,000 derricks of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. Whoever had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord in the care of Jehiel the Gershonite. Then the people rejoiced because they had given willingly, for with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. So, how do they fund the building of the temple?
Sources. One is conquest.
Yep.
You know, David conquered people and then brought all the spoils and used that. And then also the free will offering.
Yeah, you've got the two of them. So conquest and free will offering. They have wealth of their own now. This is the big difference from tabernacle times. Why I made a big deal about where did they get their wealth. Egypt said, take it with you and leave. In fact, I'm paying you to leave. That was Egypt's perspective. And so really Egypt is the one who funds the tabernacle building. But at this time, they are established. God has blessed them. He's given them safety and security during the days of David. He's given them conquest. One great way to make people rich is go kill the people who had stuff and take it. And that's exactly what they do. And they conquer everybody that is around. And they amass such a large pile of wealth. If you remember, when I was concluding my discussion of 2 Samuel and I was talking about some of the differences between David's kingship and Solomon's kingship, wealth is one of those answers. David devotes so much of his wealth to the temple that we don't see massive public works during his reign. We don't see him making fortresses. He's not really establishing standing armies. He kind of is, but not to the level that Solomon is going to do, where he's got like a rotating standing army going on. He doesn't really develop those public works. He's very much a warlord king. But Solomon comes in, sitting on a nest egg that his father's been making for who knows how many years, and then he adds to that nest egg, and he will have public works. The first of which that we're discussing is the temple. His palace is another one. He renovates most of Jerusalem. He builds, fortresses all over the place. Yes?
When you made your warlord comment, but part of the reason that this is the case as well is, David was far too busy fighting in battles, and Solomon has peace.
Yes.
There's times, there's opportunity to do these type things, which David didn't really have. It was bloodshed all the time.
I mean, just imagine. Put yourself there. You're standing in the Jordan River Valley, and they have made on the ground, as far as you can see, these molds. And they used the mud of the Jordan Valley to make these molds, and they're just pouring bronze into it. So much bronze that we don't even know how much they used, because the Bible says they didn't know how much they used to make all of the bronze implements for the entirety of the temple. Do that during David's reign and tell me how that's going to go. You're going to have Moab jump in the river. You're going to have Ammon jump in the river. You're going to have Amalek coming up from the south. You're going to have Philistia coming from the other side. You're going to get those weird kings over there in fledgling Assyria coming down. You're going to get Joe Schmo Hittite guy, last remnant of that empire, coming down. because you can't defend all of that. That is the kind of peace that he really has during his reign. That you can have just people working with precious metals, acres and acres and acres of them. And it worked. Any comments anybody has before we go on to another section? Cool. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to hit out of here. Let me make sure. All right, look in 2 Chronicles with me, chapter 2. 2 Chronicles 2. So 2 Chronicles 2 and 1 Kings chapter 5. So 2 Chronicles, I'll go back to my list here. Okay, 2 Chronicles chapter 2 through 5 and 1 Kings chapters 5 through 8 are parallel passages. They say nearly identical things. Some of them put them in a little bit of a different order. Some of them talk about in a little greater detail of one thing or the other, but they're nearly parallel passages. And so I'm going to run through the Chronicles one, chapters 2 through 5. Write down 1 Kings 5 through 8. Read it on your own time. Landon will love you for it. It's good material, but I only have another 30 minutes, and we have all those chapters still. So let's get back to my temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 2, Solomon decides it's time to do all of my building things. He's killed all the people he's supposed to kill. It's time to turn to public works. And he purposes within himself to build a temple for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. It's going to take him 7 years to build the temple, 13 years to build his palace. Solomon assigns 70,000 men to bear burdens, 80,000 to quarry in the hill country, and 3,600 to oversee them. Big difference here is right now it kind of sounds nice. Oh, we've got Israelites doing all these things. But no. Drop down to verse 17 of that chapter, and it tells us Solomon counts up all of the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel after the census of them that David his father had taken. And there were found 153,600. 70,000 of them he assigned to bear burdens, 80,000 to quarries, and 3,600 to overseers to make the people work. Did you guys catch that the numbers are the same? How is he building this temple? Yes, the Jews are the ones funding it now. Big difference from the tabernacle where really it comes out of Egypt's wealth. But now we're going to really build it using foreigners. They're not Israelites. They're the people down in the quarries, the people that are down in the hill country working, they are Gentiles. And they're conscripted. Don't get the idea here that they're paid well and it's very nice. They are conscripted to work. They do not have an option here. This is kingship of the ancient world. He has decided to build a public work. If you go and work, you will eat. If you don't, I will make you work, and you might not eat. That's Solomon. When you get to Rehoboam's day, When you get to Rehoboam's day, and he becomes king, and he's asking, how can I be a good king? And they talk about, your father's yoke was heavy. This is one of the things that they are referencing. Is that his public works have to be made, and he forces people to do the work. You get food, you're kind of taken care of, but you have to work. And it's been that way for almost all of human history. Just now do we have laborers who kind of have a little more rights. You don't have those kind of rights when the public works are needed to be big. Yes?
They're supposed to be wiped out.
Yeah.
When the Israelites came in, they were supposed to be just destroyed. So, this is kind of like the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were slave labor.
Yeah.
That was their deal. Same thing.
You're exactly right. And it's really remnants of his father's war. These resident aliens, many of them are probably transplanted from cities that his father had destroyed. We see that happen with Israel. When they're taken off into exile, the reason they're taken off into exile is because you conquer land, you take those people, you put them somewhere else, and you get people over here and you put them in that land, they don't rebel. Well, now they're stuck, and they're put to work. Any thoughts anybody has? Any other comments on that? Yes.
Notation here in my Bible says that they used 3,750 tons of gold and 37,000 tons of silver.
I believe it.
Wow.
I believe it. I didn't do math.
Because those numbers don't even mean anything to me. Like, some of you, it might mean something if you were in the trucking industry or, shipping industry. Maybe it might mean something to you when we start talking thousands of tons. But you say thousands of tons, you might as well say it's the size of the Statue of Liberty. I don't know how big that is. Like, it's big. It's a lot of stuff. And some of it, like the bronze, they don't even count. They don't even know how much of that they used. Yeah. Okay, let's read a little further. So, he decides he's going to do this. He's conscripted these people in. He sent messengers up to Hiram, king of Tyre, and he says, we need to make an arrangement here. I know you liked my father. I like you too. You have some great goods. We want the cedars of Lebanon. And so he has this very fancy speech that he gives in chapter 2, ultimately leading down to, if you'll provide workers, I'll provide them with food. And they do. He's also going to promise some cities that Hiram is then going to reject. And then Solomon's going to be like, well, then you're not getting paid. And there's a whole discussion there that hopefully Landon will handle, because that's not really temple related. But just understand, the whole payment of all of this cedar is more than just the food that he is offering in order to care for them. And it's a lot of food. 20,000 cords of wheat, 20,000 cords of barley, baths of wine and baths of oil. I mean, it's quite a substantial amount of supply that he's offering to the woodsman in order to get the material shipped down to him. Hiram loves it. Hiram says, it's a great idea. I'm going to ship stuff to you. You can build a whole bunch of things with it. Everything's going to be just fine. And he also says, I got a guy. And in Chronicles, he's called Huram-Abi in verse 13. In Kings, he's just called Hiram. So there's your names are a little different there. But this Huram-Abi guy, in Chronicles, he is called the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father is a man of Tyre. In Kings, what tribe is he from? He's from Naphtali. Well, hold on a second. How could he be from Dan and from Naphtali? This is why I put a map up here, because maps are fantastic. You have Naphtali up there, and you have this little town called Dan. And if you remember your Judges, Dan was a tribe down here, and they did really bad at kicking out all of their enemies, so much so that they ran away, and they fled way up all the way to the top. And that's where they live, is now up there. So when it calls him a man of Dan, well, it's probably the city. And what tribe is that Dan in? It's in Naphtali. So that's how you make some reconciliations. I only bring that up because some people will try to use that passage to say that there's an error. It's like the easiest one to disprove, but I read one scholar that did it, so I'm telling you. Okay, so we have this guy, and he is of Dan. He is of Naphtali. And he is very skilled in a whole bunch of stuff, and Hiram says, I'm going to send him down. Now, remind me, and you guys can go ahead and turn back over there to Exodus in chapter 35, what tribe do the two men come from? One is Judah. What's the other one? I'll give you a hint. It's one of the two I mentioned of Huram-Abi. Exodus 35, verse 34. Dan. Isn't that interesting? I think it's interesting that in the building of the tabernacle we have Judah and we have Dan, and these two are going to be north and south. Like, that's your border right there, ultimately. But it's not that, not yet then. And then when we're going to build the temple, we get another guy out of Dan. I just think that's cool. I don't know if there's really any significance to that, but I feel like the poor little tribe of Dan needed a little bone to be thrown, and you got a smart guy both times. I think that's cool. So he gets sent, and he's going to be responsible for making sure all of the fancy things are fancy enough to go into the temple. Any comments on chapter 2? We're back in Chronicles. I'm back in Chronicles. I don't know where you are. I told you I had a lot to talk about tonight. In Chronicles 3, Solomon builds the temple. Its structure is really interesting. It is exactly twice the size of our tabernacle here. So you take all of the measurements of the temple, divide them in half, you've got your tabernacle. So we're upgrading, is what we're doing. In 2 Chronicles chapter 3, down in verse 3, it tells us that the length in cubits was 60 cubits, the breadth was 20 cubits, and it's also going to have a 30 cubits in there as well. Or a 20 cubits, 60, 20, and 20 is what we're talking about there for those measurements. The vestibule on front of that also is of 20 cubits, and so you can see kind of what we're looking at here is this structure in the middle. That's what we're talking about. So this inner structure is one, then it has an entryway, sometimes it's called a porch, sometimes it's called the vestibule. There's a lot of words used for it, but understand there's this little extra structure right here. And in a moment, we're going to talk about the entire outside structure. So this gives us a nice little inside, but on 3 sides of it, it's going to look like this. Okay. So the vestibule in front of the nave is about 20 cubits long, and its height is 120 cubits, and he overlaid it on the inside with pure gold. Here's another controversy. In Kings, we're not told how tall this thing is. In fact, we're not really given much understanding of even if it has a roof. Some of your images, in fact, even if you look in your class books, if you guys brought your class books on lesson 14, I think there's actually a bigger picture for lesson 15. Yeah, so if you didn't, here's your picture. This is your temple here, and these 2 little dots are the pillars. They are not connected to the temple. So, temple, pillars. They're not connected because we don't know if they were or not. Notice how this artist has drawn it. These pillars are structurally sound, holding up an arch or a roof here to the porch. Now, one of the issues we have is Kings gives us no height. But Chronicles gives us a height. What is the height? 120 cubits. How many feet is that? I don't know. It's like 150 or something. 180? 180 feet. Does that look like 180 feet to you? The answer to that question is no. So this is an alternate image. Does that look like 180 feet to you? Yeah. Most of the time, you're going to get this image if you're looking for temple images. Because most scholars take the Septuagint's understanding of this. The Hebrew says 120. The Septuagint says 20. So the Septuagint's understanding is that there was a roof, and it goes on those pillars, and it is about the same height as the temple. Maybe a little bigger, but about the same height as the temple. But the Hebrew does not say that. The Hebrew just has the number 120. It doesn't even say cubits. It just says its height was 120. Every other time it said cubits. So we don't know for sure. I have my opinion, and then I'm going to let you guys give an opinion. I think it's this one. And this is why. What is on top of the tabernacle? The pillar. What is on top of the temple? A pillar. If we're continuing the one-to-one that we are updating from the previous, if you are coming up to Jerusalem, could you see that pillar? Yeah. It's white stone. What's it going to look like in the blazing sunlight? It's going to look like it's on fire. It's going to shine for everyone to see. And so, in my opinion, it's the big one. That's why I like this image. Because to me, that is what the temple looked like of what Solomon built. Now, Do we know for sure? No, because Kings doesn't give us enough details, and the Septuagint in the Hebrew confuse us. And y'all can take up your opinions at this time. Any thoughts? I've convinced you? I really am a good teacher. You're just pondering. Okay. You can also see with this image a little bit clearer these storerooms that are going to be all on the outside. When we think of a temple, we want to think of it as a freestanding structure all on its own. We're thinking Greek. You walk up to the temple, it's this massive building, and what's inside is temple. But that's not really what God's temple was. God's temple is a small structure surrounded by a little bit of a smaller structure that had storerooms filled with anything that is needed in order for the functioning of the temple. And so that's kind of what it looked like. Really, if you came up and you saw the temple itself, you're more than likely looking at the side of it, which is a storeroom. You're not really looking at where God is dwelling. That's kind of enclosed. That's protected. And only on one side does it have an entrance, and the other sides are all enclosed. Any comments anybody has? Okay. Going back to this image, notice here, you've got a tiered section. So this is a cutout to show us what it looks like on the inside of these storerooms. If you look in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, starting off in verse 11, it says, no, that's not where I'm wanting. It may be in Kings. It must be Kings is the one that has it. But Kings talks about it, where the bottom one is 5 cubits, the one above it is 6, and the one above it is 7. So as you go up in these storerooms, the walls become thinner, therefore giving you more room, which is pretty good building. Some have, this one kind of has them staggered, like you can see each time it comes up, and it's got a little bit more space, a little bit more space. Some of the representations I've seen try to make the walls slanted as they come up, still giving them that space, but narrowing as it comes up. Take your pick. That's all guessing from that point. All right, anybody have any comments on the structure? We've got a building. It's divided into 3, 2 parts in one part in the next. We've got the storehouses all on the outside. We have 2 pillars as well. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 15. He makes 2 pillars, 35 cubits high with a capital of 5 cubits on top of each of them. He makes chains like a necklace. He puts them on top of the pillars. And he made 100 pomegranates, and he put them on the chains. He set up the pillars in front of the temple, one on the south and the other on the north. On the south he called Jachin, and the north he called Boaz. Writer of our class material helpfully has translated that. Jachin means he will establish, and Boaz means in it is strength, or in him is strength. So there's our pillars holding up the front. They could also be out here. We don't know. It doesn't tell us. So just understand modifications in your mind. Any thoughts? It's actually quite small. Let's see, it was 60 cubits long. What is that, 90 feet? How wide do you think this building is from this room? Anybody got an idea? Anybody can measure? How long? From that corner to that corner, how far is that? Temple is smaller than this is long. That's the point I want to make. It's not that big. We think about it being this massive structure, but it really only has one purpose: for Levites to go inside it to worship God. You're not gathering people inside. You're gathering priests inside, and even they don't spend a great amount of time in there.
It is, though, about half again as tall as the current Dome of the Rock, so you can get a good visual. This was 50% taller.
Yeah, it's good.
You know, when Samson collapsed the temple of the Philistines, how many people died? 10,000 or something like that? Or I don't know.
1,000. I mean, it was a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been a large structure.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm thinking this is not as big as some.
Yes. And it's a big difference in
How God is worshipped. We haven't even gotten to the furnishings. Chapter 4 talks about the making of the furnishings. In chapter 5, they're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant in. So we've got these furnishings here, but this is all you need to worship God. You have a few things on the inside. You've got the candelabras here along one wall with a mirror on the other side. You have the table of showbread. You've got the altar of incense. Done. There's nothing more that goes inside. There's no chairs. There's no extra tables. Nobody's coming in there to stay for any length of time. No worshiper ever enters those doors. Whereas when you look at the other temples, you need people on the inside. You have priests that have things that they're doing on the inside all day long. They're doing logistical things, bureaucracy things. You have people coming and meeting and staying on the inside, like we do with churches today. You go, you sit, you stay, you gather, you meet. You don't do any of that with God. When you are at his temple, you do one thing and one thing only. You worship. And if you're a normal guy coming out of Asher, you're not getting any further than here, because all you need is to access that burnt altar. And that's it. You never touch this. You don't touch these. You don't touch that building. You don't touch on the inside. You give your offering, you get your portion back, you leave. You have worshipped your God. Very different than pagan worship. Any thoughts anybody has on? Yeah.
They use all the cedars forward, look like it's mostly a block, mostly gold and all that. But they're saying they got a lot of cedar.
Great question. So
Everything that you see that is gold on the inside is cedar first. So they did stonework, and then they did cedar on the top, everything. All the way around, everything you see is cedar, and then they covered it all in gold. These doors are the same way, made of the cedar. A couple of different kinds of woods, but wood, covered in gold. These at the front are panel doors. They have doors here as well, but the doors don't get to close because the poles stick out, and so they've got a curtain that closes instead to cut off the most holy place. It's a good question, though. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? So, we've got these movable water. So, one of the big questions everybody has is, you got this giant basin, and this giant sea is supposed to be used for purification. And really the impression that the scripture gets, or gives, is that the priest submerges himself in this basin. But there's never any mention of a ladder, never any mention of stairs. There's really no way to get inside of it, or even really to put water into it. So how did they use it? The answer is these. They take water out of it somehow, whether it's a drain of some sort, or they somehow get above it and take the water out, but they fill up these mobile ones. And so what those are mobile areas for the priest to be able to reconsecrate himself as he moves along. So he comes along, he kills your animal with you, he is unclean. He's touched blood, he's touched a dead animal, he has to re-clean in order to move forward. He's the only one that gets to do that. If you came and you offered your sacrifice and you got blood on you, you killed that animal, you touched a dead animal at that point, you're unclean until evening, even though you came to worship your God. But the priest gets to unclean himself, re-clean himself. That's the word I want. He gets to re-clean himself, whereas everybody else does not get that option. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. I think that's fair. That's a pretty good spot for me to take a transition. So I want to go back to my list. And with our closing minutes, I want us to look in 1 Chronicles 24. Because with the building of the temple, we have a shift in priesthood. It's kind of interesting. It's the same thing. Hebrews makes the same point. With a change of priesthood, you've got a change of law. Well, with the change of building, you have a change in your priesthood. Because up until this point, a very few individuals are actually serving as priests, with the vast majority of them kind of just doing nothing. Because remember, there's not a whole lot for them to do at the tabernacle other than assist you with your sacrifice. But now we're moving into a larger, more centralized, more structured worship, where more sacrifices are going to be offered than even what the law of Moses requires. You need more helpers. How do you decide who is the priests? What's rule number one? You have to be Levi. I would go even more specific than that, but I'm going to say that's rule number one, because, you got to be the right tribe. Rule number two, Aaron. But we have a problem. In 1 Chronicles chapter 24, the divisions of the sons of Aaron were these. The sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. Nadab and Abihu died before their father and had no children. Eleazar and Ithamar then became priests. You had the three of them. And that's it. Those three were the originals. But Eleazar and Ithamar have children. And it tells us that with help, they come down and they try to figure out who all is alive. And so down in verse 4, they discover that there's more men of Eleazar than there are of Ithamar. And so they organize them. They organize them into 16 heads of their father's houses for the sons of Eleazar and 8 of the sons of Ithamar. They divide them by lot, all of them alike, for there were sacred officers and officers of God among both the sons of Eleazar and the sons of Ithamar, and the scribe takes everybody down, and then they start to draw lots. So what's happening? What's happening is you have a massive amount of people who all really want to work at this temple. Where before, you had a small amount of people willing to work at a tabernacle. That's kind of old. It's kind of ratty. We don't really like it. Saul forgot it. Nobody really worked there. But now this is big and new and shiny. Well, how are we going to decide who works and when they work? So the first lot in verse 7 falls to one guy, and they go all the way down until they find 24 of them in verse 18. In verse 19 it says, "These had their appointed duty in their service to come into the house of the Lord according to the procedure established for them by Aaron their father, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded them." So, we establish these individuals, and there's 24 new groups. So 24 groups of individuals that are going to be working in the temple. Each one takes a week. And kind of on average, you work twice a year. Now, 24 and 24 is not exactly a year, even under the Jewish calendar. So what that does is it rotates you. No one family will always be priest serving during their feast. So, each year, a new family is in charge of Passover. A new family is in charge of Day of Atonement. A new family is in charge of those other feasts. And they rotate and rotate and rotate. And they stay that way. When they go off into exile, it gets real muddy. And they come back, and Nehemiah and Ezra have to sort through all of this. Some of the lists that you see in Nehemiah and in Ezra are them trying to decide, is this still a pure bloodline or not? Can you really trace them back to Eleazar or to Ithamar? That's not the only question now. Can I trace them back to one of these fathers? That's now the question. Now, I say all of this, one, because I'm in charge of the temple and I'm supposed to talk about it, but because this matters in Luke. Look with me in Luke chapter 1. Those of you who remember, whose story are we looking at in Luke chapter 1? I hear a lot of murmurs, but nobody really wanting to shout. Yeah, Elizabeth and Zechariah. We've got the birth of John the Baptist coming up pretty rapidly. And we're only going to look at one verse because I'm not here to talk about Elizabeth and Zechariah. But in Luke chapter 1 and in verse 5, somebody read that for me.
Days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth.
Okay. What course is he a part of? Abijah. Go back with me. Hopefully you kept your finger there because I didn't tell you to 1 Chronicles 24. We're going to find his name. 1 Chronicles chapter 24, and we start going down that list. We start with number 1, that's Jehoiarib. Nope, that's not it. Jedediah, Harim, Seorim. In verse 9 of 1 Chronicles 24, you've got Malchijah, you've got Midjamin, you've got Hakaz, and then you have Abijah. He is the 8th one. So Zechariah can trace his lineage back to Abijah, and then by extension to either Eleazar or Ithamar. We don't know which one they fall on, but it's one of those two. And then ultimately to Aaron. So that's cool to me, that we can see something going on in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. We can see something that is being established, that is brand new, never before existed. And it connects to the New Testament to tell us exactly what Zechariah was doing. That he had been selected to serve for his week. And it was his turn. And he gets to go in, and he gets to work at the temple. He gets to serve God. He gets to have the responsibility of doing the sacrifices, of lighting the candelabra, of making sure that the bread is eaten when it is supposed to be eaten. He only gets that opportunity twice a year. And this is it. Any comments anybody has? We have 1 minute. I'm going to circle back. I'm going to answer a question that was asked to me at the beginning. Why are there so many candelabras? Why are there so many candelabras? My answer to that is because everything is covered in gold. You want lots and lots of light. Because when you walked into this temple, you are blinded by the splendor of God. Every surface has God's relief on it. The palm trees, the pomegranates, the flowering blooms. And you are blind by how radiant the Lord is. My last thought is this. You and I take the Bible for granted. We've had it our whole lives. But can you just imagine that you're a Jew and you're of the tribe of Asher, you're of the tribe of Dan. You will never step foot inside the temple. But you can read about it. And what a blessing that truly is. Thank you very much. Landon comes back next week. See y'all later.
In heavenly honor